Good evening, everybody who's come on board for this fascinating webinar with these wonderful public intellectuals. My name's Kate Auty and I've been asked to engage myself in launching John Wiseman's fabulous book. And you're all here because there is grounds for hope and courage in the climate crisis. Wisdom and action in the long emergency is something that's going to engage us all. Before we go to anybody speaking to the questions tonight, I'll just acknowledge country. I live and work in Taungurung country. This is halfway between Canberra and Melbourne and a world away from both in many respects. Taungurung people have very significant rock art sites in the Garden Range, just to the east of this little town of Euroa. They have put together a dictionary. That's really something quite remarkable from the point of view of people coming back to culture in a way that embraces all of the things that colonialism endeavoured to strip from them. I want to acknowledge Aboriginal people for their resourcefulness and their resilience. We would have been holding this particular webinar in Wurundjeri and Bunurong country, and I also want to acknowledge Wurundjeri and Bunurong people. Those who are coming to you tonight to speak to John's book will be coming from various parts of country, and it may be that they would like to remark on that before they say anything further as they speak to this particular book. This is tonight the launch of John Wiseman's book, and I need to make a couple of housekeeping observations. It's published by Palgrave Macmillan. It's now available for purchase. You could go to the MSSI website to find out more about that. And you could also take on board the fact that if you purchase it now, I understand, John, there is somewhat of a discount. And one of those wonderful bookshops in Carlton, namely Readings that I remember from my early university years, has copies of it, probably stacked on one of the front tables. This is going to be recorded, so you do need to keep that in mind. The public intellectuals you're going to hear from will speak for 10 minutes after John has spoken for 15. Let me just make some comments about myself. I come to this with a background in law and environment, and I've been mentored very significantly by Aboriginal people. I don't want to say anything more about myself because I want to try and get to what you're here to hear about. Introducing the panellists and also the author, I'll do all of that before we come to anybody speaking so that we don't break up the conversation. And please, while we're going through the discussions, could you use the chat to tell us what Aboriginal people's country you might be coming in from, to list some questions, and we'll endeavour to get to all of them. And if you use the chat in that way, it means that we can really probably run this conversation right out to 7 o'clock for a highly effective discussion. So let me just go to the author and the panellists, and pardon me for reading. John, of course, is Professor John Wiseman, and he's the author of Hope and Courage. He's an honorary fellow with the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute. He's also a senior research fellow with the Melbourne Climate Futures and an adjunct professor at the Melbourne School of Population and Global Health at the University of Melbourne. He's, of course, otherwise busy, as are all the people you're going to hear from tonight. He's a visiting fellow with the Centre for Climate Economics and Policy at the Australian National University, and he's a research fellow at the Centre for Policy Development and a board member of The Next Economy. John's major research and policy contributions have been in the fields of social justice, citizen engagement, globalisation impacts, social wellbeing policy frameworks and indicators, sustainability transitions, and climate change risks and solutions. His current work focuses on the actions needed to accelerate the transition to a just and resilient post-carbon society. If I go to Victoria McKenzie-McHarg, Victoria will be known to some of you, I'm sure. I noted that Victoria posted about this on her LinkedIn page, and could I urge everybody to make sure that they go and have a look at what Victoria otherwise posts. She is the Strategic Director of Women's Environmental Leadership Australia, otherwise known as WELA, and she's got 15 years experience as a climate campaign manager. She's the immediate past chair of the Climate Action Network Australia, as in CANA. can I do things? And Victoria, thanks very much for being with us here tonight as one of the seriously emerging public intellectuals of Australia. It's great to have you on board. Now, we also have Professor David Karoly, and David, I have an enormously warm history with you. Thank you so much for what you do. You made yourself so readily available to young people and to the Euroa community and to everybody else who wants to hear about climate change and science. You're an honorary professor in the School of Geography, Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at the University of Melbourne, and you are many, many other things, but very warmly regarded by all of us here in the Northeast. You're an internationally recognised expert on climate change and climate variability. And I could say a great deal more about you, but I don't want to take any of your time, so thank you. Kathryn Bowen, Professor Kathryn Bowen, welcome tonight. Thank you for being here with us. So great to see you as a professor at the University of Melbourne, Deputy Director of Melbourne Climate Futures, Professor of Environment, Climate and Global Health at the Melbourne School of Population and Global Health at the University of Melbourne. With 20 years experience in original public health research, and we've just spoken about a number of your most recent publications, and there's things coming off your computer every day in every way. You're also very involved in science assessment, capacity development and policy advice, predominantly focused on climate change. These three people to speak to John's book give us such a range and breadth that we'll get to you very quickly. But John, it's important that I don't forget my major function here tonight, which is to launch your book officially. And I often get asked to do this, and I sometimes forget that the official launch is as important as every other part of the evening. So here we go, the official launch of Hope and Courage in the Climate Crisis, Wisdom and Action in the Long Emergency, all of which speaks to us as members of a public that's really engaged about these issues. All of it speaks to Aboriginal people who are part of your conversation in this book, and I want to thank you and pay respect to you for engaging with that particular conversation. Congratulations to you on this important and inspiring text, bringing hope and courage in facing the long emergency. Without courage, there is probably no hope. Without hope, why would we bother to be courageous? And you've linked them so effectively and inspiringly in this particular text, so thank you. Let's get on to the conversation. I've already observed the book's available. You will be able to get what I understand to be a discount at some places. John, and you might want to talk to us about that. I can see people coming on board with the chat, telling us about where they're from, and it's great to see people talking about Aboriginal people's cultural connectivity in this year when we think about what treaty means for what is now known as Victoria. Rod Keenan's here to say congratulations, John. The chat is underway. John Wiseman, over to you. Talk to us about this great piece of work.
Thank you, Kate. And welcome to everyone joining today's launch and webinar. We have, as Kate said, we really hoped that this launch would be face-to-face, but COVID has yet again derailed our best laid plans. So I'm really appreciative of everybody joining yet another Zoom event. I would also like to begin by acknowledging that I live on the unceded land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. The list of everyone I'd like to thank is way too long to read out in full, but there are a few people whose contribution I really want to highlight. Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute and Melbourne Climate Futures for hosting tonight's launch, Katrina Croft-Cusworth and Kennedy Mabeeva from MSSI for all their great work in organising the event, Rachel Ballard and Joanna O'Neill from Palgrave Macmillan, and most of all, my wonderful family writing support team, Faye, Daniel, Gemma, Amar and Andrew. So, Hope and Courage in the Climate Crisis explores ideas from a whole range of perspectives, from climate scientists and activists, psychologists and philosophers, Indigenous cultures and ways of life, faith-based and spiritual traditions that I believe can help us face our harsh climate future with honesty and courage, meaning and purpose. Tonight, I'd like to share just some brief thoughts on the journey that led me to write this book and some of the learning that I've found most valuable. In 2012, almost 10 years ago, I had the honour of interviewing many of the world's leading climate scientists, activists and policymakers about actions needed to create a just and sustainable, safe climate future. Their conclusions were clear and consistent. Greenhouse gas emissions had to begin falling rapidly by the early 2020s in order to avoid catastrophic climate change. Everyone I spoke to agreed that the actions required to achieve this goal were technologically achievable and financially affordable. Reducing energy consumption and improving energy efficiency, accelerating the shift from fossil fuels to renewables, and drawing down CO2 while protecting the health and well-being of all communities and ecosystems. Now, in 2021, and despite rapid expansion in renewable energy, the political obstacles preventing emergency speed action remain stubbornly formidable. Greenhouse gas levels continue to rise, and images of increasingly severe and frequent fires, storms and floods continue to fill our screens. The most recent Ipcc climate science update reminds us yet again that accelerating the transition to a just and resilient zero carbon future clearly remains humanity's most urgent task. There are some promising signs that the transition to a zero carbon economy is now underway. Governments in Europe, the US and China are beginning to demonstrate a deeper understanding of the speed of climate action now required. Investors are beginning to shift trillions of dollars from fossil fuels to renewables. Legal actions requiring governments and business to address the full extent of climate risk are having growing impact. And the huge health co-benefits and job creation potential of a climate resilient, clean energy economy are now more widely understood. But the harsh reality, as many of us are all too well aware, is that none of these actions are happening at anything like the necessary speed. Scientific evidence about global warming trends already locked in is now crystal clear. Human beings and all other species are now on a journey into an increasingly challenging, harsh climate future. So this awareness that it's going to be a very long emergency is a source of deep distress for many people, including many friends and colleagues, passionately committed to decisive climate action. The second tough and urgent task, therefore, and the primary focus of this book, is to address the question, what ideas and learning can help us face a harsh climate future with wisdom, hope and courage? Now, in framing this question, in using these words, I should emphasise the hope I'm looking for is realistic, defiant, courageous hope, not wishful thinking or predatory delay disguised as naive optimism. Defiant and courageous hope means finding the strength to continue opening pathways to restoring a safe climate future while fully understanding the increasing difficulty of the task. There are times in reflecting on my experience in working on this book when I imagine all the scientists and activists, teachers and writers, poets and artists whose ideas and voices I've drawn on gathered together in respectful and intense debate. All the speakers are passionate and well-informed. The conversations spark and crackle with fierce, urgent energy. I turn first to my friends and colleagues from Indigenous and First Nation communities. We might usefully begin, they note, by deepening our understanding of the histories of the lands on which we gather and the legacies of colonialism, resistance and dispossession which have led us to this time and place. Climate justice is therefore one of the first propositions we should bring to the table. But for the principle of climate justice to be more than hollow words, we're going to need to see substantive actions which fully acknowledge and address the sources and consequences of violence and injustice. Principles and practices of care, compassion and respect will also be foundational. Care and respect for country, for all the creatures with whom we share this world, and for all the human beings who will follow after us. While acknowledging the wisdom of this opening contribution, my colleagues from the world of science and technology approach the question from another direction. Well, we'd like, they say, to highlight the power of scientific evidence, analysed through rigorous research and knowledge crystallised in the crucible of critical reason. Speaking truth to power with honesty and skill about the causes and consequences of the threats we face and the actions we need to take to overcome them. So all of this sounds eminently reasonable, but how, I wonder, do they maintain their own emotional resilience in facing tough truths about the future which their evidence tells them is increasingly likely? Here, the responses are more complicated and varied. Remembering and trusting in the disruptive, game-changing power of ingenuity, creativity, and innovation is sometimes enough. And also, meditation, art and music, working together in the garden, the kindness, warmth and joy of family and friends, walking the old dog along the beach and watching the horizon as the waves keep rolling in. My climate activist friends seem less convinced by the power and promise of reason and innovation. Listen to the science and accelerate technological innovation? Of course. There are indeed many impressive examples of the human capacity for creativity and inventiveness to overcome disease and hunger, suffering and injustice. But how do we deploy data and evidence with the speed required to accelerate just and inclusive emission reductions while avoiding the delusional hubris that there are always technical solutions to every human problem? The historical examples which my activist colleagues turn to most of all for inspiration are stories of solidarity and fellowship, where ethically informed collective action has achieved transformational change which once looked completely impossible. The anti-slavery movement, the suffragettes, the overthrow of apartheid, the fall of the Berlin Wall, but more recently, School Strike for Climate, 350.org, the Pacific Climate Warriors, Beyond Zero Emissions, the Sunrise Movement, Black Lives Matter. I'm joined then by teachers and scholars from a wide array of spiritual and faith-based traditions. The first foundational steps they suggest in times of suffering and despair are thankfulness and gratitude, honouring and celebrating the astonishing complex beauty of life on Earth is an abiding source of strength and inspiration. Awareness of the fragile impermanence of our dewdrop world is also a constant reminder of our shared responsibility to keep paying attention, to keep turning up, to hold the line, and to keep nurturing and sustaining relationships and practices of kindness and compassion, justice, love and care. And last, I turn to the critical theorists and writers, farmers, designers and engineers, poets, artists and filmmakers who can help us imagine and create the ecologically informed paradigms and practices of resilience and regeneration we will need to navigate the wild landscapes of the long emergency. Good companions who can help us to more clearly see the patterns and textures of our interwoven world and to understand and confront the ignorance, violence and greed threatening to tear this delicate fabric apart. Experienced guides who can assist us make well-considered choices about pathways we should choose and places we should land. Thoughtful teachers who can help us learn the art of living well in dangerous, uncertain times, remembering that the world is always full of surprises and the future is never entirely settled. These then are some of the ideas and insights, strategies and practices which I find helpful in answering the questions I've set myself. What sources of wisdom can strengthen our capacity to take courageous and effective action and to live meaningful lives in a world of rapidly accelerating climatic and ecological risks? Emergency speed, science-based collective action, justice, respect and care, visionary and courageous leadership, social and technological innovation, thankfulness, kindness and compassion, beauty, creativity and imagination. And also these abiding gifts, the laughter of children, the comfort of old friends, sunlight on the water, the wind in the trees, the silence of mountains, the roar of the ocean. I'd like to conclude by thanking Kate Auty for chairing tonight's event, and David and Victoria and Kathryn for joining me in this conversation. It's wonderful to see so many old friends and colleagues gathered together, and I can see lots of people on the chat, and it's great to see you, if only on Zoom. And I really look forward to continuing the discussion with you over the next half hour or so and in the future, and hopefully over a real cup of coffee around a real table. So thank you, Kate. Thanks everyone for joining, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Thank you. And there are people applauding silently because they're on mute, John, but there is a range of people who have come on this particular link, and there are some old friends there. There are some new people. There are people from the Netherlands. There are people from Gunai-Kurnow country, people from Wurrung language areas across the whole Kulin nation. So I think this book speaks to a lot of people about really complex and challenging questions. Thanks, John. We'll go to some of the intellectuals that you've brought together here. Public intellectual number one, Victoria McKenzie-McHarg. Can you take yourself off mute and start to talk to us about the things that you find really gripping in what you've read and what you know? Thanks, Victoria. Over to you.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you, John, for inviting me to be here today. It's a real honour, and just personally, congratulations on this very important milestone. It's wonderful to have this book out in the world, and I know I am just one of the couple of hundred on this call today, but many, many thousands more who have and will take inspiration and solace from your words and from your writing and your findings. So thank you very much for sharing that. It really is timely and important what you've brought into the discussion right now, not least because we're all needing a little dose of hope and courage in our COVID lockdowns wherever we happen to be, but because these two qualities sit as core elements of resilience. And resilience is almost the number one challenge that we have as we go through and as we face the future, because resilient people, resilient communities are also then those people who are able to create the future. And we can't see this future, we can't afford to see this future as written. It is not written. It is ours for the writing. And we can't do that work and create that work with integrity, with openness, with joy and love at our heart if we're not standing solidly with hope and courage in our hands to write that future for us. So I love that these are the central components of this book, and central elements that we're putting in place, or we're laying as foundations for how we're going to do this work together. And in reading the book, it was interesting for me to challenge myself about, well, where have I found hope and courage in my work, and what enables me to find it again at those moments, which can be quite confronting, where you're not sure if you really are holding hope and courage as prevalently as you would like to. And I certainly found elements right through the book that have been very prevalent through my life and my work. Connection to nature. I mean, I'm here on the land of the Gadiman and the Gulidjan people in southwest Victoria. This is the home of the king parrot people. There are king parrots lined up, outside my window. I'm on the edge, I'm right in the heart of the Great Otways National Park here, and nature and its rejuvenating qualities and its ability to take you into an actual reality outside of the spin whirl of what seems like reality of our work on this climate front at times is essential. I grew up on the banks of the mighty Murray River, and that that river, once you've ingested it, is then part of your DNA. It's part of your responsibility to own and care for that river. And reflecting on how nature has woven itself through my life and my work was really beautiful to read about in this book. But likewise, action and the ability of acting to be its own motivator. And so often I know, looking back through my work, the thing that kept me going was the momentum that had been built through action, and that ability to sustain by knowing that you're working with others, which of course leads to the themes of community. And even looking here tonight, the sort of little buzz I got by seeing these names pop up in the chat, going, ooh, ooh, people who inspire and connect and drive, that we feed off. So that sense of community, be it local, be it connected across our sectors and our work, or in moments like this, as so important to sustaining. So all of these different elements sustain and give hope and courage in different ways. But one of the things I found probably most useful in reading your book, John, was the theme of bridges, which was because each of these elements that I've spoken about, it's the way that they bridge or come together, and the way that we create the opportunities for these to come together that actually create that sustaining force for me. And it also feels like often the hardest work to be done. And I've been thinking about this recently, partly because I was thinking about what would I be saying tonight. and I realised in my work at the moment, this is the part that's hardest, the bridges. And seeing so many of us in the communities I'm working with across the Canna network, across the Weller network, here locally in Colac, Otway Shire, at the meta scale, we're holding hope and courage, and we're holding vision and creativity, and we're talking a good game. But when it comes to the hard work of making that practical, where we butt up against established ways of doing, norms of governance, approval processes, how do we inject hope and courage into something so benign and so normed and established? That feels like a really hard piece of work. But actually holding that in every one of those decisions is living the hope and the courage, and challenging ourselves to do differently, not just at the meta, but in the action taking. And I feel like I'm seeing that in lots of different ways and places. So I hold that bridge concept as really quite important, and something I've really taken from the book. That also links to another theme that I've been thinking a lot about in relation to hope and courage, which is one of scale. And this might reflect me and my networks and the places that I work more than anything else. But I feel so often when we have these conversations about, well, where do you find or see hope, and who do you take courage from? It's so often localised action that I hear people refer to, which is wonderful and deeply inspiring, and work that must absolutely be done. I cannot see a pathway out of this mess without everybody doing every bit that they can at every scale. But local on its own isn't enough. We do need to find ways to make the small local changes weave into the major system changes, and find the bridges between these two. And so often they don't naturally connect. And so again, bridging between that local to the scale feels like a real part of this. And I was thinking about examples I've seen. Greta Thunberg did not think her sole action at the local would have the scale of impact that it ultimately did. And yet it was transformed because people with hope and courage saw an opportunity and made it happen. At a different scale again, totally renewable Yakandanda, this fabulous project to make a whole town renewable, was not initiated with that vision. Some people thought they'd get some panels on some houses. And from this intention, they've taken and stood with hope and courage and looked beyond and have built the bridges to help make that happen. So I just wanted to comment on that particular element, because for me that was a real take home that I feel is very prevalent in my work and the challenges I'm seeing around our movement at the moment, and something I'll certainly be thinking about and meditating on as we go forward. But thank you again for the opportunity to be here with you, and I look forward to hearing from everybody else, and congratulations again, John.
Thanks, Victoria. Thank you. And John, I don't know whether you want to go off mute and just respond to either of those two significant points that Victoria's raised about bridges and how significant they are. That old chestnut of networks and making sure we explore and exploit them every opportunity we get. And the question of scale, how local becomes bigger than local could have imagined itself to be. Do you want to comment before I go to David?
Well, just really briefly, and thank you, Victoria, for all those thoughts and for lots of conversations on these issues over the years. I guess, yes, the point about bridges, I mean, it brings to mind two thoughts. I mean, bridges between people, between movements, between organisations, and that's critical. I also think there's a phrase in there, I think it comes from the science fiction writer Kim Stanley Robinson, who talks about how difficult it is for us to imagine the bridge between where we are and the future. You know, it's possible to dream of utopias, but how do we actually construct the bridge and the bridges, and how do we come together to do that? So I think that's, you know, the idea of bridges is important in both those ways, and maybe that links to this question of scale as well, because I really think that one of the thoughts I have just on the question of scale is it raises the question of leadership. I mean, and I think, you know, leadership's a complicated word and means different things to different people, but I do think what we need to find is ways of, you know, leadership, if you like, from both below and above, is what we're going to need to build and cross these bridges. So I agree, Victoria, on the importance of bridges and the importance of turning our local work into transformational work that can build and cross those bridges. So thank you.
Crossing bridges, fantastic, John, and thanks, Victoria. There was a question about totally renewable Yackandandah, and Dominic Hess has responded to that, but just go to their Twitter feed or go to their Facebook feed and you'll find some of what's going on there. And please do go and look at the the Weller sites that Victoria represents here tonight, because you'll find some extraordinary stuff happening amongst women in environmental leadership coming out of that work too. It's really stellar stuff. Let's go to David Karoly now. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you, John. And look, it's a real pleasure and an honour to be here as part of this panel. I described this panel to the people on the panel as a mutual admiration group in the past, because it's an honour for me to be sharing the panel with all these wonderful people. But I'm going to start by saying I am a climate scientist. A famous quote from a Hungry Beast song or rap a while ago, but I'm going to use it now to introduce what I think is a critical part of what John's book says, and that is, while climate change is often described as a science problem, climate change is no longer a science problem. We know enough science to be able to address climate change. Climate change is a people problem. It's an ecosystem problem. It's a natural systems problem and a human systems problem. People have caused it. People have to decide whether they want to fix it, and people are being impacted by climate change every day, and every species, every plant, every natural system in the world is being affected by climate change. They have no voice in acting to solve climate change. People have to speak for natural systems. I completely agree with what Victoria says, because I gain my energy and my passion because of my values in thinking about natural systems. I love the natural environment. Unfortunately, many people don't see that the economy and the natural environment are intimately linked, and human society is not possible without the underpinning natural environment. We need to not only recognize that, we need to support it. And this is another area that John's book talks a lot about, how we gain energy and passion. My values are to support the natural environment, and only with a strong natural environment can we have a implicitly stable economy rather than a collapsing economy. John probably hasn't said anything, doesn't really even say in the book, that I played a little role in this book. I think I ticked a few boxes in getting it approved to be published. Is that right, John? I think I was the reviewer, or one of the reviewers, who had to tick some boxes to say it was ready to be published and that it was fascinating, exciting, and readable. And all of those things I completely agree on. And as I said in my little review, there were lots of things that I learnt from the traditional classical philosophers in Greece to the modern philosophers. I learned a lot about philosophy from reading the book. I learned a lot about the different perspectives from religion and religious scholars and their views about nature and the environment and people and their interactions. I learned a lot about that as well. The one thing that the book is not going to teach you an enormous amount about is the latest Ipcc assessment of climate change, because that came out a month ago. So I'm going to give effectively what I think are the 3-line summary of the Ipcc. A little longer perhaps than a short poem, but look, it is now unequivocal that human influences have warmed the climate system, have warmed the atmosphere and the oceans and lands, and that warming is leading to increases in many of the changes in climate extremes that we've seen in the last Black Summer experiences in Australia, in the extreme temperatures and bushfires that we've had in Australia, and has also been experienced in Europe and in North America. The flooding that affected Europe, the flooding that's affected Asia. These sorts of extremes are where the biggest impact occurs, both on human systems and on natural systems. We know it's going to get worse, and we also know, and perhaps the most important 2-line summary, every increase in global warming leads to increases in the impacts of climate change on all systems, both human systems and natural systems, across all the different systems that make up our economy, make up our society, and make up the natural environment. More global warming means more impacts. How do we control that? We also know from the Ipcc assessment, the most powerful conclusion: every ton of carbon dioxide emissions adds to global warming. Why is that important? Well, it also means that every extraction of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere reduces global warming. Every decision that we make as individuals, as locals, as well as global communities, every decision we make to reduce greenhouse gas emissions reduces global warming and reduces the impacts. That's a really positive message. The reason that I have hope is that I gain hope from the decisions that I see young people making, the school strike for climate, the young people making decisions that, yes, climate change is going to affect their lives and they want much stronger action. Every decision that they make to encourage greater action will reduce and is reducing global warming. We know how to address global warming. Now we have the technologies to go to zero emissions very, very quickly. The decisions by governments around the world, including Australia, to delay until we've got new technologies are decisions to make global warming worse because they're waiting for the silver bullet. We have enough silver bullets in all the weapons we have, all the technology that we have to solve climate change. We can do it now. So make choices. If climate change, the reason I have hope is I've framed climate change as a decision to act now, not a decision to wait for a better technology. We know how to fix it. So the framing should be, do you want to make climate change worse? Just wait. That means you're making it worse, or act now to reduce emissions. We can do it, we can solve it, and every single action by every single person will reduce global warming if they choose to. Please make those choices. Over to you, Kate.
Thank you, David. Thank you for making us reflect both soberly and inspiring us. I wonder, John, if you want to respond to David's comment about how the natural environment inspires a climate scientist like David, and how ultimately what sits under all of this is gaining energy from values, because your book is all about that. Do you want to comment before we go to Kathryn?
Yeah, just briefly. And firstly, David, I mean, thank you also for so many conversations over the years, and for helping a social scientist understand the physical science, but also, I guess, our shared feeling that of the importance of the natural world. What I think in the book, I'd say that probably, and I think it's actually true, that one of the first books I took down in thinking about this project was Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. And as many people will know, Rachel Carson, writing back in the 50s and 60s, really is one of the people who helped us think differently about the environment, about ecology. And she's a wonderful scientist, but she's also a wonderful writer about being in nature, walking along the beach. And I think it's that capacity to combine scientific understanding with the appreciation of how beautiful the world is and how hard we want to work to sustain that. That's both an inspiration for action, and it's what keeps many of us going, I think. So I completely agree, David, with the importance of, looking closely at the science, and then drawing that inspiration from the world around us to keep going and keep acting.
Thanks, John. And just mentioning Rachel Carson, I must say it's one of those rare treats when you're in a secondhand bookshop and you find a copy of it. I'm always the person who buys it and gives it away to somebody else. So thanks for reminding me about just how critical and pivotal she's been to the thinking of yourself and others too, because there's just no doubt that she was so she has changed the way so many of us think about these things, and it's just really terrific to hear you mention her here tonight. Let's go to Professor Kathryn Bowen. Kathryn, let's hear from you.
Thanks, Kate. And thank you to the panel. Thank you to John for asking me to be part of the panel tonight. I'm coming from the lands of the Bunurong people. And I just feel that, John, your book has been quite a personal, journey. Excuse the word journey, but it's really brought up a lot of emotions for me working in this area, and it was terrific to see your ability to weave in, as both Victoria and David have talked about, the whole spectrum of philosophy through to science, through to teaching, through it's just a wonderful book. I found it really compelling and also beautiful to read. It's I think that's really a hallmark of a great writer, is that it's easy and beautiful to read. And I think that I really have enjoyed delving into it over the past couple of weeks. And I wanted to provide some reflections from my reading of your book, which resonate closely with my own current thinking, really. And to me, these form part of the most important components for hope and courage. And they link, partly David's comment around values. That's in fact one of the points I pulled out from the book. I've got 4 main, maybe 5 if I have time, main points I wanted to reflect upon in this brief discussion, because I'd like to leave a lot of time for broader discussion. And one of the first points was around purpose and knowing what our purpose is. And I really think that if we're clear on our purpose as individuals and as communities, it makes it so much easier to keep going and to maintain and create the hope and courage that we need. And I think I'll point to, referring to your book, page 15, where you refer to Camus, who addresses the challenge, which he describes as the one truly serious philosophical problem. How do we sustain meaning and purpose in the face of overwhelming evidence that all our dreams and actions will finally end in darkness? So he reviews, as you note, a range of possibilities: romantic love and hedonistic passion, the intensity of performance, the thrilling conquest of the adventure, and so on. But he argues that they are all, in the end, elaborate distractions from the stark reality of our predicament. The only truly authentic response is to fully acknowledge the overwhelming absurdity of human existence. And then, and this is where I pick up another one of my points from your book, and then to join with others in defiant, fierce, and passionate rebellion. And I think that was just a beautiful encapsulation of really understanding what our purpose is. And for many people, it is rebellion, it is activism. And I'll get to activism too as one of my points. But what links with purpose is values, as David's already mentioned. And these, again, like purpose, these relate to us on an individual level, on a community level, on a national level, on an international level, all of these scales that Victoria also mentioned the importance of understanding. And you note in your book, particularly Bhutan's example of the gross national happiness wellbeing framework. And I think that's a wonderful example of how we can understand the values, what determines the way we choose to live our lives. And so I've been incredibly fortunate enough to work a few times in Bhutan and work with the Gross National Happiness Commission there and try and understand their approach and their recognition that it's not just about economic productivity. That's just one element of how we see and value humans and other beings that we share this world with. So I think values is so important, and you've pulled that out through the book beautifully. Another point, my third point that resonated very closely with me, particularly at the moment, and I'm sure with many people as well, is the point around what we would notionally call self-care, although I much prefer your noting of it as creating a practice of resilience, replenishment, and regeneration. That's a beautiful phrase. And I note that, and I'll just flick to the page where Leslie Head and Teresa Harada, and I'm talking about self-care of individuals and not just people that work in climate change, but everyone who is concerned about climate change. And it's interesting that Leslie and Teresa, when they explored the diverse array of coping strategies employed by climate researchers and policymakers to overcome despair and sustain emotional resilience. And I think we've already talked of, John, you talked about this in your opening, about the whether or not people exercise, engage in yoga and meditation, art and music, and, as we've just been speaking about, the healing power of the natural world. And I must say, just on a personal level, if I'm not exposed to nature during the course of my day, I'm a fairly grumpy person to deal with. So I think it's just so important that we recognise what is important for us as individuals. It'll be different for everyone, but just identifying what is important to you to make sure that you can maintain, you can create and maintain the practice of resilience and replenishment and regeneration. And then the other point that I saw, and it relates to the purpose as well, is around activism, and it's coming up more and more now, and particularly what would have been seen previously as quite a tension between academics and their role as activists. And that would be interesting to start a discussion about that after we all speak as well. But I just note your reference to Johan Rockström's work, and in 2019 when he published his article on social tipping dynamics, and he talked about 6 social tipping points, which were informed by a literature review and a survey of the world's most eminent social, economic and climate scientists. And there are 6 of those points, but I just wanted to focus on one, which is strengthening climate education and citizen engagement. And that gives us a taste of the importance of engaging as citizens and seeing ourselves as researchers, as teachers, as doctors, as whatever it is we are, as part of the citizen engagement. And I think that that's becoming more and more important as we must fight to see the changes we want to see. Also, you've got a lovely quote here by Ness as well, and he talks about the remedy against sadness caused by the world's misery is to do something about it. And again, that calls us to act. That really does. And then there was another Vandana Shiva quote, of course, which you managed to pop in there. And I thought that was, again, calling on the activist. And she talks about hope as something we cultivate in our daily consciousness through our daily actions. So everyone who's feeling a little hopelessness needs to get engaged with turning bread into a sacrament at every meal. If each of us not just became conscious in our eating, but became engaged in the political and social activism, to recognise that in our daily bread is an interconnectedness of care for the earth and care for the community. It is the link between ecological action as well as social justice action and health action and political action. It's all in that food that we eat 2 to 3 times a day. And I thought that really was a beautiful quote from Vandana Shiva in there. So they were a few of my reflections from your wonderful book, and I really found those main sort of points that I've pulled out of there resonated so closely with me, and it's such a wonderful book. So congratulations from me, John.
Thanks, Kathryn. Thank you. John, I wonder if you wanted to comment on the Vandana Shiva quote that Kathryn so evocatively put back before us from your text.
Yeah, sure. I'll be very brief because I'm sure I'm keen to hear the other conversations as well. I mean, I've always found her work extraordinarily powerful in bringing together what we learn from our daily practice, the making of our daily bread, so to speak, and then the links to the much larger forms of social change and social action that we need to take as well. And just noting some points, in the chat. A number of people have been saying, well, yes, values are important, philosophy is important, but hey, we need to turn this into substantive, practical action. We need to change our political systems, our economic systems, and I think that's maybe that's something we can talk about over the next half an hour. But I think to try and capture the kind of essence of what I was triggered my interest in this book was to say, well, absolutely, we need to accelerate emergency speed action, and we need the resources, the ideas that can keep us going while we do that. So I think it's that challenge of bringing together the awareness of the urgency of action, and then the resources that can help us keep working. So and I think Vandana Shiva's work is one very fine, inspiring example of that. And thank you, Victoria and David and Kathryn, for all those reflections. Really appreciate it.
And John, they're not the only reflections, as you say. There's a lot coming through in the chat, which we will save, I understand. I understand Missy will save the chat and bring that to your attention probably later. I wanted to just take you to a couple of things that have come through in the chat. And there's a question about the post-growth and post-capitalist world from Hans Bauer, as you probably can see in the chat. But I wanted to bring you to something that Lynette has asked about, which is, it's a political question rather than one about economics, although many people would say they're the same thing. And it's about, how does the interpersonal become collective? How do you get from the personal to the collective? And what's been the lessons for you in the work that you've brought together here in the book about that transition or transformation?
It's a great question and an important one. It's 2 points I think I'd make. I mean, one is, one of the striking things I think about when I think about to use that overused word, journey, that many of us have taken over the last 10, 15 years in relation to the climate crisis. We've all come from many different points, from backgrounds in science or in ecology or in the arts or in social change and social justice. And I'm really struck, however, by the way in which those very different starting points have led so many people to come together into a whole range of climate justice, climate action organisations. So that's a point I think about how we come from our individual starting points, but we realise that we can only bring about change by working together. I guess the flip side of that is the number of people who I talk to, and I'm sure lots of people on the call talk with, who say, and the most powerful source of inspiration is working collectively with other people. It is not feeling isolated, not feeling that we're on our own. So joining together in collective action is both essential for getting things done, but it's also, I think, essential for our own individual emotional resilience, if you like. So I think those two things connect strongly.
Thanks, John. And actually what I'll do is I'll also go to some of the panel, if you don't mind, at this stage. And Victoria, I was really keen to hear from you about making the interpersonal, turning the interpersonal into the collective, because of the work you do with Weller and the work you've done with Canna. And you might want to comment on that.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. I think it's an excellent question, and I think it really speaks to the heart of how do we make this happen at scale, really? Because we do need to manage this transformation personally. We all do need to find our own sense of hope and courage, and build our resilience, and think so very differently in our own lives and about our own behaviour. But we have to make that way of thinking about the world, collective and political. And to me, that, I mean, it sounds incredibly boring, but it's structures and process and governance. And I hear that question, and I think that there are the example that Kathryn spoke to earlier that's included in the book about Bhutan. They've taken that value system and systematized it by actually putting in place a measurement. Likewise, we saw from New Zealand the wellbeing budget, taking these concepts and formalising them. I've just started reading Mariana Mazzucato's book about the Moonshot mission, and the thing that was most surprising to me in that book is the governance, which and how important that was in what that allowed, and what that created for a whole system that was able to think at a different scale and in different ways. So how do we bring these concepts that feel deeply personal and sit in what's often shaped as soft and fluffy, actually bring them into the hard spaces of our work and soften the barriers and own the responsibility of putting these values into our systems. The one challenge that I would add on there, not only is that hard to do, it can be hard to do at speed because these systems are designed for slow so often. And so that's where, again, being activists, to build in another theme that I've seen coming up in the chat, owning our role as activists, owning our courage and stepping in to find different ways to influence change in places that might not seem ready for it is the task. And that's where we need to step up every day.
Thanks. And David, you've got your hand up. So David, would you like to comment?
I would. And look, I completely agree with what Victoria's been saying and also what John's been saying, but I'm going to come at the, if you like, building connections and communities from a slightly different perspective, because one of the things that often is comfortable is for us to work with like-minded people. And what is critically important with building these connections and bridges is to build a resilient and safe transition that includes all people. People with very different views need to be included, and the hard part is to build bridges over barbed wire fences or over barriers, because we need to make sure that there's a safe and resilient transition for all people, irrespective of their politics and irrespective of their thinking, because they need to be included. And that is hard, as I've found out at various times in the past, but I still believe we cannot have these sorts of safe and resilient solutions. We cannot have hope and courage for all people unless we include all people. And that's sometimes difficult.
Yeah, David, that's the metaphor for the night, building bridges over barbed wire fences. If I wasn't doing this role of chairing this, I'd be tweeting that exactly right now, and I hope somebody is. Kathryn, let's go to you, because this is your field of endeavour, thinking about capacity building and creating these links, getting from the interpersonal to what would be described as collective, doing it across cultures with different people who may not be on the same side of that barbed wire fence.
Thanks, Kate. I entirely agree with what's been said already. And I think what we are yet to talk about is the power of listening and the power of empathy. And I feel to a large degree we've lost the ability to actively listen. And sorry, I've got a child coming in the bedroom. What's up? That's all right. Off you go, please. I want it. Cool, gorgeous.
That's great. Get that kid in here to the video.
Her. She's the most important person.
Come in. Oh, she's gone now.
Okay.
But she's my 8-year-old. But I think that is actually by listening to others who don't agree and don't see the world the way we all do, is one of our only ways out, because if we don't understand where they're coming from, why they have a particular perspective on this an issue, once we have that time to sit down and understand what the barriers are for them, give them time to speak and listen. And this isn't just at an individual level, obviously. This is also at an organisational level and at a community level as well. But the power of listening, I feel, is something that we just don't talk, ironically, enough about. And so it's going to be one of the only things that enables the empathy that we need to develop to understand different points of view. And it's not just around climate change, it's around different points of view in every part of our lives that we lead. So, and in my work, yeah, as you say, Kate, most of that's in the global south, as we call it now, the countries that are less economically developed as ours. And what I've learned in the the decades working in that area is that most of the time I just listen. The answers are in those communities or those government departments. The answers are there. It's about bringing them out and framing them in a way that a donor, for example, whether that be the World Bank or whoever it might be, a climate change financing mechanism, needs to see it written for them. But the information, the knowledge, the understanding is always there with whichever communities we work with. And it's really about taking that time to listen and pause and reflect and understand.
Thanks, Kathryn. And look, there's a heap of questions and comments coming through the chat, and it's very difficult to keep up with you all, but we're going to save those. I just want to make a couple of comments, John, and ask you to respond. There's a comment there from Russell Sully, which says, every small step counts, which is what we've talked about. There's a comment there also that maybe your book could be called The Forest of Hope and Courage. And of course, those two things go to Victoria's point, which is this stuff takes time. And we are at a place where we require urgent action. And we've heard from Kathryn and Victoria and also David about activism and what that means for what you're thinking about in writing this book. Do you want to comment on how we get from reflection and listening and thoughtfulness to what we know we need to do, which is get to action? And this is really the crux of it in many respects from what's coming through in some of the comments.
Yeah, sure. So let me begin. I want to make a couple of points. One is the point about listening. Maybe that's only the beginning of action, but there's also a lot of people commenting in the chat about the experience of young people, the experience of children, and some of that builds on, some of you will have seen the recent survey published about young people around the world and the levels of concern and anxiety. 60-70% of young people really expressing deep concern about where we're heading, really deep concern. And there's a writer, a climate writer called Keaton Joshi, who I thought had a really nice analogy in a feed I saw in the last few days. It said, well, it's not surprising, is it? I mean, imagine if you've got some children in a car that's and they're in the back seat and it's going fast down the cliff, and the adults in the front are kind of ignoring them and just saying, hey, we're having a good time. And it's not surprising that that the children and the young people are concerned. So I do think the point about listening is, and listening to young people, to young activists, to the people in School Strike for Climate and so on. I actually think that's a really important place to start. And I do think, when I think of the example of, it's only, 2 years ago or something, where none of us had heard of Greta Thunberg. None of us had heard of, a young woman who sat down on the steps in Sweden. And yet, over the last 2 years, that individual action combined with, really smart, strategic thinking, really careful tactical decisions has led into a very large social movement. And so, I mean, that's, yet another example of the speed with which things can change. But I also think, and I'll finish with this to make another connection. I mean, Victoria talked about the economist Mariana Mazzucato, and who work on mission-oriented social change, mission-oriented economic change, really does draw our attention to activism, community networks. All of these things are important to change values, to drive action, but to really turn these from good intentions and fine words into serious change. We've really got to learn how to turn our values and ideas into different sorts of institutions, different sorts of policies, different sorts of investment. So I think that's a challenge for all of us on a call like this, to listen carefully, but also to work out how we, to use the bridge word again, how we build the bridge from fine words to substantive action.
Yeah, John, and in fact, that comment's been made, or comments along those lines have been made by Mike Salvaris in the chat about the ultimate problem is the dominant model of societal progress is wrong. So that's a question that reflects on some of what you've just said. You might want to come back to that, but I wanted to just thank Annabelle Workman, who's raised a question, which is, how do you operationalise what you're talking about in this book for younger people or for children? So Kathryn, your child just came in and left. We've got that door slammed on us by your child. But how do you operationalise it for younger people, John? You've talked about Greta Thunberg and tactics, and of course we know that media has been a major part of what's been done, but it's not the only part. And we've learnt some of these lessons with our COVID capacity too. We've got good at digital technology, but we all know we'd rather have a face-to-face meeting. How do we operationalise all of these changes in a technological age for young people?
Well, I mean, Annabelle, thank you for your question. And I think there's one kind of question about how do we work with young people who are climate activists, and how do we listen and support that work. But I think there's also a question in there about how we work and talk with younger children, and how we find the words, perhaps the pictures, that are both honest, compassionate, thoughtful. And I actually think maybe it is a good moment, Kathryn, to throw to you there. I mean, what's your thought on how you engage, say, with your children on these questions?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I must say, though, just last night, I overheard my 8-year-old talking to my 10-year-old. They were brushing their teeth in the bathroom. The 8-year-old was saying to my 10-year-old, "Did you know that Scott Morrison hasn't set strong enough targets for 2030 for greenhouse gas emissions?" And I said to my partner on the couch, "Shh, can you hear that?" And I just let it run, and it was, and my older daughter said, "What?" And she said, "What's this about?" And she said, "Yeah." She went on. She said, "And for 2050, he hasn't set any goals at all." And I just asked her a little later on in the evening what they were talking about, and she said, "Yeah, and this is to my point, I saw it on BTN." So I think that the power of the media, even especially for children. So my children don't watch television as a rule. We have a television, but the only station it plays is the football, apparently, according to my partner. It's the only station that works. But the media and the ability of children to recollect that information and spout it off, and then start talking to their friends potentially about it, and is as I saw last night for the first time, really, the power of the media for children. And obviously that can be used and abused, but I found that quite interesting. I don't talk a lot about climate change to my children because I talk about what we can do, and they're very aware of environmental issues, and they're active in their school, in their sustainability committee and things like that. But there's a balance, isn't there? Because it's a scary concept, and there's a feeling of guilt from myself as well, in that it's our generations and the generations before us that have created this mess, and we're leaving it to our children and our grandchildren and their children to deal with. So there's a few of my reflections on that.
Thank you, Kathryn. There's a couple of questions that I think are bound together, John, and one comes from Charisse Sonika, I think is the appropriate pronunciation. And Sonika says, what binds us together? What will get us over the hump and binds us together? And that links to something else that's been here in the chat column about how do you get people who work, who have a daily life, who are engaged in the daily grind, to see the need for social, economic and political change, the sorts of things that you're talking about. Some of that's uplifting people, some of it's taking them away from the daily concerns. What binds us together, and how can we make sure that we do our bit to try and ensure that binding happens?
I mean, what binds us together, when I look at, read all of the comments in the chat, all the, several hundred people on this chat, I mean, I'm really struck by some common threads that are running through there about a passionate sense of justice, a passionate sense of concern for, the world that the beauty of the world we're in and we live in. A passionate sense of creating a sense of opportunities for our children and our grandchildren. I mean, I think these are all, these are the reason why we are on this call, why we're working on these issues. These are the things that we share. I think the challenge for us is to find the ways of turning those values, those shared concerns into shared and effective action. And I think that's that's a really strong theme, I think, coming through in the chat and in the conversation. How do we communicate with each other? How do we find the words? Maybe we need to think more creatively, not just about words, but about art and pictures and films and images and music. Maybe those are some of the ways in which we need to join together as well. But I'm keen to hear other people's thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, David, let's come to you, because this point about art and music and culture and how this plays out in what we would describe as the climate scientist's mind. I know that you're passionate about bringing a range of people to the table. Do you want to comment on why that's a powerful way to get to change?
Very happy to, Kate. And yes, you and I have talked about this, and John and I have talked about this a lot. And it's clear that many people don't think just in terms of numbers and graphs like me. That actually most people like pictures, they like art, they like music, they like things, and I do as well. But it's actually really, really important to think about the way that other people learn, and in particular to recognize that talking in language, music, art, stories is often better ways of communication, better ways to engage with a wider range of people than graphs and numbers. That might surprise most of the scientists in the audience, but I don't think it does. And that's why I've been involved with artists and musicians and organizations and collaborating with them to help communicate what are critically important issues that John's been involved with and we've been talking about tonight, but to think about it in safe, spaces around communication, using art, using music, using theatre, using language that everyone values, and ignoring mostly the numbers and graphs.
Oh, David, you'll be a heretic. Can I just say, if everybody's interested in that particular point, the Australian Dance Party has some fantastic videos. They are a little Canberra troupe and they put together some fantastic videos. The one they've done on Dive Into a Carpool about carpooling and sharing transport is absolutely genius material. It's to the Blue Danube. There's a Volkswagen and it involves synchronised swimming. And I don't want to say any more. I just want you all to go and find it. Go and find it. It is inspiring and it just breaks up the paradigm and is so creative. Victoria, you talked about progress and process and the nuts and bolts, and I know that you also are passionate about the way we think through these issues with an artist's eye. Do you want to comment as well?
Yes, I mean, look, I think that creativity opens new spaces and new ways for us to see and imagine the future. And what's interesting in the climate space is I do think we are starting to see a really productive emergence in the creative arts that is helping us think about the world in very different ways. For a long time, we were seeing a lot of dystopian fiction as the creative response to the climate disaster, which, I mean, has its place. It's not my gig, but it also potentially limits and starts writing stories that feel inevitable. And I certainly know I was seeing that in parts of our communities. So thinking about the role of art and creativity in a range of different ways is incredibly relevant. And I pick up on the question that was made before about how do we take the personal into the political and the structural. I think we also have a challenge of how do we bring the artistic and the creative into our processes and into our lives and our policies and our governance and institutions, because this is the stuff of life and it's the stuff of it's values in action and values communicated in different ways. So I think that's quite important. I wanted to pick up, if I could, just really quickly on the former question as well, which is around how do we bind together and how do we bring people out of their daily grind and engage with these questions. And I think that this comes back to a degree a question of leadership. And there was something commented before, there was comments made before, particularly by Kathryn, around listening and active listening as a key task of leadership. Collaboration is the other approach to leadership that we think about a lot at Wella, where we're talking about women's approaches to leadership, and we see collaboration and networks as something that's often reflected in women's leadership and very much at the fore of how a lot of women, and not only women, but particularly women, are choosing to lead. And we see that happening and a desire for that to happen across sectors as well, really actively. And again, listening, collaboration, these are processes that take time, and they're processes that we really need to commit to. And to David's point about opening to difference and to opening to not just diversity but genuine inclusion, and we have to create that. That has to be a really active choice to create the time and make the space for those things to happen if we genuinely want to bind together. But where that butts up against some of the question around how do we engage people who are in their daily grind is that not everyone wants to engage in epic transformational change, as hard as that might be to believe. But we come to this with change at the front of our minds, and we already know the vast majority of the world do not like change. They don't want to talk about change. Most people want things to stay the same. And actually what we're doing here is radical action to keep things the same, to keep a livable planet, to make sure your family can survive, to make sure you can put food on the table. And so thinking about how we actually frame for our audiences and communicate in the ways that resonate for them, as opposed to us, the revolutionaries, I think is also really, really important in that. in that process.
Thanks for that. Thanks. Another piece of heresy. So this whole panel will now be taken out and burned after David saying throw out the graphs. Could I just make this comment? We've also got somebody talking in the chat column about invisible work and about the invisible work that gets done, about people who engage in promoting change, erase themselves, move on, and are happy to do that. And Kathryn, if I just go to you about that, there's so many people in Indigenous cultures doing exactly that, who commit 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and we don't necessarily value it in the way we do in the West. Do you want to comment briefly on that? Then we'll go quickly back to John, because we've got about 4 minutes left. And John, we're going to run over time, but I'll make sure we don't.
I mean, that's a massive point, Kate, and I can't do justice to an answer to that in my own capacity as well. But my main point would be that we need to be much more respectful in the way that we develop solutions, and that is legitimate, authentic partnerships are developed that are led by First Nations communities, and we have so much to learn. Yes. It's a very bleak sort of situation we find ourselves in at the moment, so we can only improve. Yeah.
Thanks, Kathryn. Thank you. There'll be differing views about this, but I'll put it out there. We need to be making sure that the Uluru Statement from the heart is something we embrace, however we promote and produce an outcome for our country and for Indigenous people as they would like it to be done. So thanks. John, let's go back to you. We've got 3 minutes. It may be that you've got something final to say, and then I'd just like to thank people for being such an engaged group of participants. That you could hardly call them an audience. They have participated in the chat and participated in the Q&A. Over to you, John.
Yeah, I mean, reading the Q&A, I do hope we can somehow capture it, because I'm not going to begin to try and summarise the range and the thoughtfulness of comments in there. I mean, I can see all sorts of people throwing in, for example, on the questions of art and music, you know, examples like climate, like music for a warming world. I know that Charisse Songkiller, who you mentioned earlier, Kate, who asked a question, would want us to think about the potential for comedy to cut through some of these issues. So there's a whole host of creative thinking and linkages there. There's a whole lot of people talking about how do we turn this into a change of government, perhaps Australia, sooner rather than later, in terms of, and that's clearly a critical pathway to turning the ideas we're talking about into action. There's all sorts of really valuable insights there, and I just wanted to really conclude by thanking Kate, you and Victoria and Kathryn and David, but also everyone who's been part of the conversation. Definitely, lots of defiant hope and courageous action on display, and really look forward to continuing the conversations in a park somewhere before too long, hopefully. So
hopefully, John, hopefully that's what will happen. We'll all be in a park at some stage having these conversations. Can I just thank everybody who's come along tonight, who's participated, who's used this chat column, which I'm sitting here squinting at in the sort of darkness of this front room of my house, who've engaged with the questions big and little, and thank you to the panellists, because of course David, Kathryn and Victoria have really warmed to this conversation. And John, can I say I hope to find your book in a secondhand bookshop very quickly so that I can buy many copies of it and share it with people. But I also hope people will buy their own copies and leave it on the tram for the next person, because of course that's the best place to pick up your next lot of reading in my long experience of Melbourne. Thank you, John, for inviting me to chair this. It's been a real pleasure. It's full of warmth, it's full of defiance, it's full of aggravated people wanting to see things done better and to get to change and to do it in a just and equitable way. And your book has inspired many of us to think just exactly that. Thanks for this evening, and thanks everybody. It's time to go to your dinner. Good night.